The clay tablet flared in the smuggler's hands when the constable's torch caught the stall, and someone shouted,
"Seize it!"
Suspicion steered the occult researcher forward before he processed the crowd. He pushed through elbows and canvas. He smelled boiled fish and damp wool. He saw the smuggler's fingers tighten on the tablet, pale clay glowing where the light struck a cluster of etched wedges. The first 5 sentences lay out the problem. The researcher knows a word can change things, and tonight the city will try to make that word disappear. Suspicion sat like a hard coin under his tongue. He had suspected for weeks that banned syllables moved more than minds. Now a simple auction had turned into a legal seizure. Someone shoved him. The researcher tasted metal and the sweat of other bodies. Move back. A town constable barked. The constable's voice cut across the market. The crowd hushed a fraction and then surged. A man in a coarse coat shoved the smuggler toward a low table. The smuggler clutched the tablet as if letting go would let the marks breathe. "Hands off that artifact," a voice said close to the researcher. Layla. He felt her presence before he saw her. The light picked out a coil of dark hair and quick fingers. Layla's eyes moved fast. "Layla," he said. He did not ask for permission. He reached for the tablet. The night market raid becomes the immediate conflict. A constable slammed his cudgel against the wooden table. "Town constable," someone named aloud, forcing the researcher to step back. The town constable's boots thudded. He moved to intercept the researcher as the smuggler hissed, "It's worth coin."
"Let it go!"
The constable ignored the plea and seized the slab. The researcher said, "Let me see it." Now, his voice was low and measured. Suspicion pushed him to claim the tablet. He had followed rumors of forbidden grammars for months. He had tracked tracings from temple ledgers into private hands. He believed the marks on clay were more than dead scratches. Leela flashed a narrow smile and met his eyes for a beat. "We need proof," she said. "Proof won't help you in public, Nathaniel. They'll burn you first." He did not answer her name aloud. He never used his given name in the market. They fought for a second, and then a clatter announced the arrival of constables. A town constable barked something about ordinances and blasphemy. The smuggler shoved the tablet beneath his cloak. A constable's torch hit the tablet's edge. The light made the cuneiform seem to breathe. Someone in the crowd muttered a prayer. The market's watchman grabbed the smuggler by the collar. The tablet slid free and fell, narrowly missing the cobbles. A constable kicked it. Clay splintered. A thin line radiated from the break. The researcher lunged, palm smearing damp clay across a wedge. He tasted dust and iron. Layla's fingers were in his face. "Nathaniel," she hissed. "We leave now." He looked at the shard between his fingers and at the list of city ordinances. He heard the constables counting seized goods. He felt suspicion morph into a sharper hunger, curiosity. They escaped down a narrow lane while torches and shouts receded. Leela carried a cloth bundle. The researcher kept his coat collar high. He kept thinking of the wedge he had touched. He kept a small trimmer in his hand that he could not name. They reached his study, a cramped room behind a bookbinder's shop. The study smelled like old glue and horsehair. In that cramped study, the researcher laid the tablet on a small oak desk and unwrapped the seized cloth. Leela pulled a brass lamp from her satchel. She set the lamp beside the tablet. The lamp's wick smelled of whale oil. She cleared a chair with a sweep of her sleeve and stooped to the tablet. "Tell me what you saw, Layla." He traced a wedge with a fingertip. The clay edge dug into his skin. "A repeated cluster," he said. "A consonant cluster that does not belong to any known dialect. It repeats in a circular order." He paused and let his breath settle. Suspicion had become attention. He kept his words spare. If those phonemes describe an action rather than a name, they could cause change. "The ledger entries I found hinted at verbs tied to objects." Layla's fingers hovered above the marks. "You always said language does work on matter," she said. "I did not want to believe you would prove it tonight." Layla opened a small notebook and carefully copied a wedge into ink. Her hand held the pen steady. She spoke in short phrases. This wedge returns in temple inventories. This loop appears on amulets taken from tombs. Brother Anselm has one similar in his index. The researcher rubbed his jaw. He felt curiosity shift into a cold focus. He needed a cross-reference. They walked before dawn to the monastery where Brother Anselm kept catalogues. The monastery gate gave a dry creak. The researcher knew Brother Anselm by the way the monk's eyes avoided direct light. Brother Anselm favored lists over speeches. He carried a ledger like a second skin. Inside the archive, the air smelled of leather and beeswax. The researcher placed the shard on a linen cloth and pointed to the wedges. Brother Anselm, show me entries with this loop. Brother Anselm hesitated, fingers grazing his signet ring. We destroyed many parchments under orders. Some items exist only by memory. He looked at Layla and then at the researcher. His hands trembled. Show me the catalogue, the researcher said. Brother Anselm led them past chained shelves. He opened a folio with a rusted latch. The folio recorded a sequence of purges. Dates, inventory numbers, names of temple keepers. The ledger had a margin note in a different hand. Burned, prohibited speech. Brother Anselm's jaw tightened. They gave us orders, he said. Orders from the chancery. They feared unrest. The researcher watched him close his eyes for a moment. Suspicion curdled to a sense of political design. A sound at the doorway snapped every head. The researcher's shoulders rose. A rival cultist stood where the arch framed him, cloak soaked from the dawn. He watched the ledger. His lips were thin. The rival cultist carried a press-sealed emblem. He did not speak. He only looked. The researcher felt an immediate shift from curiosity into alarm. Brother Anselm, Leela aloud, who else knows? Brother Anselm tapped a list, those names. Father Mathis signed several orders. The researcher read the names and felt the ledger's ink pull at him like a constraint. If Father Mathis sanctioned purges, they were not clerical prudence. They were political erasure. Brother Anselm's knuckles whitened. The researcher tried to extract more. Brother Anselm began to trace references to sealed vaults. There are ledgers kept in a sealed vault across the cloister. I can show you once the refectory clears. Layla shifted her weight. We must be careful. She said they will watch the vault. Father Mathis' men patrol the cloister at noon. The researcher felt a steady anger build. Suspicion had moved into outrage. He spoke through clenched teeth. Then we go before noon. They worked quickly. Leela whispered while she copied catalogue entries. The researcher watched the cloister courtyard through a slit in a shutter. Men with pale belts walked in pairs. The rival cultist reappeared as a shadow by the scriptorium. He did not approach. He only observed. The researcher kept his head down. At noon, Father Mathis himself arrived in the courtyard. A small guard accompanied him. He wore a plain cassock and a heavy cruciform. Father Mathis' face was flat with certainty. He spoke to Brother Anselm in calm, clipped tones. The city requires compliance. The safety of souls compels the order. He looked at the researcher, who stepped forward with the shard wrapped under his coat. Father Mathis, you are Nathaniel of the Binder's Alley. You consort with known keepers of forbidden lexica. The researcher met Father Mathis' gaze. He felt anger and a need to hold ground. I seek facts. Father Mathis, he said. I seek to know how words were removed from memory. Father Mathis' jaw tightened. Words can call things into being. We cannot permit anyone to practice such speech. Leave the shard with me. The researcher folded his arms. The courtyard became a stage. Brother Anselm shifted. Layla's fingers brushed the ledger she still carried. The rival cultist's eyes slit. Father Mathis' voice amplified. By decree, I order confinement of dangerous items. He motioned to two guards. They stepped forward. The researcher put his palm to the shard inside his coat. He felt the clay warming slightly against his skin. A subtle event occurred that neither man anticipated. Layla whispered a syllable under her breath while reaching for the ledger. The nearby reliquary blinked. A loose filigree fell and powdered the monk's robe. Dust rained down in a thin sheet. Father Mathis lunged. What did you do? he demanded. Layla's hand stilled. I only read the line, she said, her voice short, her eyes wide. The researcher felt a new emotion swell. Fear. The street outside the cloister hummed with rumor. People had gathered to watch the dispute. Town constables waited at the gate. The rival cultist slipped into the crowd like a blade. He watched Layla's face. He did not move. Father Mathis advanced with a formal accusation. Nathaniel, you spread dangerous speech. Layla, you uttered heresy. Brother Anselm blocked him, not heresy. Inquiry. Father Mathis struck the ledger with a gloved hand. This is not inquiry. These lists threaten order. The guard reached for the researcher. A quick argument broke into a shouting match, 3 rapid back. And 4th lines, Father Mathis. The researcher said, listen. This ledger proves orders came from Chancery, not from presbyters. Father Mathis shot back. Orders spare no one. You endanger souls, Layla snapped. You burn grammar to hide power. Father Mathis, you accuse the church. The researcher replied, I accuse the Chancery of political eradication. The voices rose. The crowd muttered. The argument did not resolve. Father Mathis ordered the shard taken and the researcher detained briefly. The researcher allowed the guards to examine his satchel but kept his hands steady. Layla and Brother Anselm moved to pry a sealed folio last used to index confiscations. The rival cultist watched with a half-smile. While Father Mathis distracted the courtyard, Layla and the researcher sneaked beneath a stair to a sealed archive vault. The vault's door smelled of cold iron. Layla found a small gap under the latch and slid in a slender file. She forced the lock with a borrowed hairpin and the resin from a candle. Inside the vault, the researcher found administrative orders bound in thin vellum. He read aloud in low, clipped sentences, purge lexica, retain only liturgical forms, burn private inventories, record names for recompense. Layla traced a line. They listed temple keepers and merchants. They ordered targeted seizures. Brother Anselm, who had followed, pointed to a rubric. Do not publish reason. The ledger proved the prohibition was politically motivated. The researcher felt outrage harden into a precise purpose. He spoke, voice low. They erased words to prevent certain rituals used by elites to secure control. This is not only theology. This is policy. Layla looked at him, and then at Brother Anselm. We have to show this, she said. We must make the ledger public. Brother Anselm breathed shallowly. If Father Mathis learns, he broke off. A sound interrupted them. Footsteps in the corridor, too many and deliberate. The rival cultist's silhouette passed the small window. The researcher slammed the ledger closed and shoved it beneath his coat. He felt his heart beat against his ribs. He felt a rising panic in his throat. The emotion shifted from outrage to immediate dread. They almost made it out of the vault when a hand seized Layla's sleeve. Father Mathis stood in the stairwell. His face was unreadable. Brother Anselm, turn over all contraband. Brother Anselm's voice was thin. Nothing. Father Mathis looked at Layla. You attempted to remove an official record. That is theft. The researcher stepped forward. Father Mathis. The researcher said, the ledger shows orders to erase language that affects matter. You are a signatory on several pages. Why did the church take these measures? Father Mathis' eyes narrowed. He answered slowly, because certain syllables were used by secret houses to bind men, to influence courts, to topple rivals. We acted to prevent chaos, Layla. Then why not prosecute the houses? Father Mathis did not answer. At that moment, Layla made a decision. She pulled out a reconstructed phrase she had copied earlier from the shard and set the vellum on a small table. Her hand was steady, though her face was pale. If these orders hide political control, she said softly, then the words exist for a reason. I will prove it. The researcher lunged at her. Layla, no, he grabbed her wrist. She looked at him. Her chin lifted. Nathaniel, she said, we have ledger proof. I will speak only a single phrase. His hand tightened on her wrist until the skin creased. He felt an internal struggle, whether to stop her and risk losing the evidence, or to restrain her and face Father Mathis' wrath. A rival cultist stepped from shadow. Don't be a fool, Layla, he watched with an expression that contained satisfaction. Father Mathis' hand rested near his cassock. Leela inhaled and then spoke the reconstructed phrase in short, deliberate syllables. The air in the vault changed in precise, concrete ways. A scrap of vellum on a nearby shelf trembled, then unspooled in a thread of soot. A small reliquary at the far end of the room shed a flaking filigree that clattered to the floor. The researcher heard the sound as a dry scrape and the scent of singed glue. Leela's breath hitched. Father Mathis recoiled. Brother Anselm made a single motion to cross himself. The rival cultist's lips curved. The researcher had to act in that exact moment. He stepped forward, palms out. He tackled Leela to the table and pinned her arms as the room filled with dust that had texture and weight. They wrestled for seconds that felt long because action concentrated thought. Leela struggled and then went still. Her face was wet with sweat. The researcher felt a sharp fear. His fingers cramped, his jaw clenched. Father Mathis' guard moved in. He barked a command, seize them both. Take the ledger. Confine Layla for questioning. He used the wrong name for Layla, and the researcher noted the clerical habit of renaming. Outside, a bell clanged, the rival cultist retreated and disappeared. Father Mathis ordered a public accusation. The researcher and Layla would be charged with inciting dangerous speech. The guards bound Layla's wrists with coarse twine. Brother Anselm protested and then fell silent when a guard shoved him. But Leela had not spoken without intention. Before the guards hauled them away, she slipped a tiny shard from the tablet into her sleeve and tucked a narrow slip of vellum into the ledger. The researcher did not see the movement until after the guards had closed the vault door. By then Layla's hands were empty, and she wore a look of cold determination. At the cell, Leela leaned back on the bench and looked at the researcher. Nathaniel, she said, voice flat. You must follow the ledger's trail to the chancery. They kept lists in the city registrar. They kept copies with merchants. The researcher leaned forward. He felt his anger sharpen into resolve. We will not let them burn this evidence. We will expose these names. Layla closed her eyes for a brief count. I did not want to summon anything, she said. But the ledger needed proof. A mid-chapter cliffhanger snapped the scene. A guard brought in a scrap of scorched paper with a sigil that matched the tablet's loop. Father Mathis put the scrap on the bench with deliberate, clean fingers. This came from the southern docks, he said. You were near the docks last night. The researcher looked at Layla. She looked away. The guard's eyes flicked to the researcher's satchel. The researcher felt a cold calculation form. Someone in the chancery had moved to corner them. They were marched through a narrow alley to the temporary lockup. The researcher watched the alley tiles for anything out of place. He noticed a small crescent mole on a merchant's cheek in the crowd, an insignificant detail, but he logged it. Remembering small details had kept him alive through many inquiries. That night, under the cell's weak lantern, Layla whispered plans. She spoke plainly. Brother Anselm can smuggle a copy out in a book of chants. I can meet you at the binder's alley when you regain freedom. Take the ledger pages we hid. The researcher repeated the names. Father Mathis, Brother Anselm, Layla, rival cultist. He spelled them out to fix them in his memory. Brother Anselm visited and left with a rolled prayer. He pressed his fingertips to the researcher's knuckles in a way that conveyed both guilt and necessity. I will protect what I can. I made the index before I burned the rest. The researcher felt trust shift into cautious hope. He understood that Brother Anselm's choices created new entanglements. The rival cultist reappeared in rumor. A messenger left a wafer with a cipher. Leela slipped the shard she had pilfered beneath a loose stone at the alley mouth. The researcher set himself to work. He kept his sentences to himself and his hands constantly busy, cataloguing each scrap in the ledger they had smuggled away on Brother Anselm's person. Late that night, in the alley behind the binder's, Layla met the researcher with a small lantern and 2 wrapped folios. She handed him a single brittle fragment she had kept in the fold of her sleeve. "This came from the tablet," she said. "Keep it close." He took it and placed it in his palm. The clay was warm because of his skin, not because of anything more mystical. He closed his fingers. They argued over the next step. "We must go public. Layla, we must show the ledger to guild masters." The researcher shook his head. "You saw Father Mathis' men. They control the courts. If we go public, they will seize more and burn the ledger. We must find the chancery copy first." Layla's voice tightened. "Then we steal it." They exchanged 3 rapid lines, an argument compressed into small phrases. "We steal it." "Layla, we do not run blind," the researcher replied. "We do not watch them burn what they fear, Layla." The researcher looked at the fragment in his palm. He felt outrage return as a steady muscle. He felt fear braided with a purposeful calm. He slipped the fragment into his pocket and wrapped both folios in oilskin. The chapter's climax awaited. Layla insisted on testing a full reconstructed phrase to prove the ledger's claims, producing an immediate physical effect in the cellar and forcing a confrontation with Father Mathis and the rival cultist. They had already reached the cellar and tested a phrase earlier in the chapter. Now the consequences have split the allied group. The researcher watched Layla's back as she moved into the narrow doorway of the secret cellar. The rival cultist loomed in the stairwell like a question. Father Mathis' face was drawn and pale. When Layla spoke, the cellar reacted. A shape of soot and smudged ink raised itself off a wood crate and beat at the air like a small, animal hand. The researcher grabbed Layla and pinned her to the floor beside the crate. Father Mathis looked away and then recovered with a hand raised to strike. The creature collapsed when they smothered the phrase and scattered the remaining fragment into a brazier. It burned with a sound like soggy parchment. Layla slipped from their grasp and vanished down an exit the researcher had not known existed. Father Mathis barked orders. Brother Anselm fractured from his earlier loyalty and joined the cleric's men. Layla left with a fragment. The researcher stood among scorched glyphs and scorched paper, listening to the thin hiss as the ash settled. The last paragraph ties directly to a concrete event. The researcher pocketed the final fragment Layla had taken and stepped into the alley where rain had started to fall in short, sharp beats. He pulled his coat tighter and followed the sound of pattering water toward the docks, where the chancery kept its registries. He had ledger names, a burned sigil, and a fragment that still hummed faintly against his palm. He felt a cold certainty that he would follow the erased phrase until someone could answer why those words commanded matter and why men in power chose to erase them. He moved into the rain with the shard under his palm and a list of names in his head. The chapter ends with the researcher making a choice to pursue the missing chancery copy, his hand closing around a fragment of forbidden clay as he steps into the alley, rain making the cobbles shine like wet slate. The smuggler shoved the clay tablet into the researcher's hands and spat one word. "Take it." Suspicion sat behind the researcher's ribs the way a lodged stone sits behind teeth. He kept his mouth stiff and his gaze flat. A boat rocked against the jetty. Lantern lights slashed across wet planks. Someone in the dark hissed the count of coins, and the smuggler's hand tightened. The immediate problem was plain. Inquisitorial agents patrolled the embankment, and the tablet would be easier to seize than to sell. The researcher did not introduce himself. He tightened his coat and thumbed the brass rim of his spectacles. He saw the tablet tremble in the smuggler's grip and heard a soft hum from the clay. He had handled strange tablets before, but the hum matched nothing in his catalogue. He felt a shift from suspicion to practical urgency and let that urgency drive his next move. "How much?" he asked. "Enough," the smuggler said. "Take it now before they circle." Thomas arrived at the stair, breath ragged. He carried a folded scrap of parchment and wore the monastery habit frayed at the cuffs. The researcher led them up narrow stairs and into a safe house room lined with damp sacks. He kept his voice low, because a shouted count would bring patrols. Sister Miriam waited with a lamp under a salt-stained hood. She did not reach for the tablet. She watched the object like someone watching a stopped clock. "Show me the marks," she said. The researcher turned the tablet under lamplight. The etched signs swallowed light in patches. The smuggler's voice faltered. "I thought it was worthless clay. It flared when the constable's torch hit the stall," he said. Tension shifted again when the apprentice, Thomas, put a hand on the researcher's sleeve. Thomas' breath came in short pulls. "Master, Thomas, an inquisitor sent me. He offers the monastery protection if we hand over forbidden items." The researcher set his jaw. He felt a wave of careful resolve settle into his posture. He counted reasons to refuse out loud. If the Inquisition gains this, they will burn the tablet and list every name who saw it. Sister Miriam's fingers tightened on the lamp stem. "We can hand it over and preserve the scriptorium," she said. "Or we can hide it and risk being accused of sheltering heresy." Her voice did not tremble, but her thumb scraped the lamp rim to keep steady. They moved the tablet by agreement to a back chamber at dawn. The researcher wrapped it in linen and slid it into a crate padded with old manuscripts. He did not place it on the main table. He wanted the tablet beneath the eyeline of the archive while he examined the marks without exposing them to casual visitors. He spoke in short sentences to coordinate their movements. "Thomas, fetch the magnifying lens. Miriam, lock the outer door and keep the key against your belt." Thomas nodded. Miriam set the lamp on a metal bracket and closed the shutter. Light pooled small and sharp. The researcher began to catalogue the signs. He traced the grooves with a careful fingertip. The marks were not names alone. Some lines suggested breath. Some wedges bent into loops that matched no alphabet in his ledger. The emotion wrote aloud in a clipped tone. Suspicion. He felt suspicion as muscle. It made him test each assumption by action. He dictated labels as he worked, not alphabetical, phonetic markers. Performance guides. Sister Miriam leaned over the table until a thin line of sweat showed at her hairline. Thomas shifted weight from foot to foot and kept his voice small. "Master, what if the marks are spoken?" he asked. The researcher tapped the tablet. "Then one sound could change the room," he said. The next event arrived when the monastery bell tolled an extra strike. Footsteps on the outer stairways dampened as someone paused below. The researcher kept his face neutral and closed the crate lid but did not bolt it. He set the narrow black notebook on top of the lid and wrote a single line. A tapping came at the outer door. Sister Miriam crossed to the door and opened a narrow spy hole. She mouthed a single name and then shut the door again. "Inquisitor Loth," she said. The word had weight. Thomas' shoulder rose. He pushed a hair out of his eyes. The arrival forced the group into a new choice. They met the Inquisitor in the antechamber. He carried a formal warrant and a soldier's air. Inquisitor Loth's robe had clean seams. He spoke without raising his voice. "Sister Miriam, the Church requires access to all prohibited texts for catalogue and purification." Miriam held the lamp so its light hit the paper. The Inquisitor read each line and then folded the warrant. He did not conceal the small smile. "Produce them now, or I will list the archive as harboring sedition." The researcher felt irritation spark into fear. He kept those motions short and visible. He set the crate on the floor and spoke plainly. "We will comply with lawful process," he said. "But this tablet is under study." Loth's eyes sharpened. "Under study? With whom?" he asked. Negotiation hardened into a small battle of wills. Thomas stepped forward and spoke faster than the researcher expected. "Inquisitor Loth, the scriptorium catalogues all donations. We will yield material in due order." Loth's hand lowered to a leather strap at his belt. He did not touch it, but his stance changed. Miriam stepped between Thomas and Loth. "I will not let your men barge into the inner sanctum," she said. Her voice had the brittle note of someone who keeps order by habit as much as by faith. The researcher watched the Inquisitor's face for a sign, and found none. Then Loth produced a small official seal and placed it on the table. You have 24 hours to present the forbidden items for inspection, he said. He left his deputies to mark the outer gate and went back down the stair. After they closed the doors, the group heard the gate latch under a different rhythm. Thomas exhaled with a sound like a small stone dropping. The researcher felt the next emotion shift. From measured resolve to a burning urgency to understand the tablet before any official search. We cannot wait 24 hours, he said. He opened the crate and set the tablet on a piece of wool. He spread an old folio beneath it to catch stray dust. He read aloud short notes from margin etchings in other items. The marginalia did not belong to the tablet at first glance. It was a folded scrap tucked into the pottery case, a line written in a dead dialect. Thomas found the scrap and flattened it on the table. He read a single phonetic cue aloud before any of them grasped the import. The syllable landed in the room like a stone hitting water and produced sound, not meaning. Thomas stopped mid-breath and blinked. It says, pronounce the breath at the slit, he said. His voice pitched low. Miriam covered her mouth with one hand. The researcher leaned in until his spectacles reflected the ink's tiny hooks. He felt a new tilt of dread and the familiar pull of scholarly need. He ordered. Read every marginal note. Thomas, gather every shard with inscriptions. Miriam, keep the corridor watch. Do not answer the gate. Someone knocked at the outer door before Miriam could move. The knock came sharp and 3 times. Sister Miriam put her fingers on the latch and looked at the researcher. His lip pressed a line. He moved without hesitation. Tell them the archive is closed to visitors, he called, and his voice crossed the antechamber like a measured bell. The soldier outside did not reply. After a pause, a voice asked, Sister Miriam, open for a petition of the Inquisition. The voice carried a confirmation code. Miriam did not open the door. The 3 of them exchanged quick looks. Thomas' hand trembled as he placed the marginal scrap into his vest. The researcher folded the folio and placed his palm over the tablet. Tension escalated into fracture when she would burn the tablet. Her hands were steady. If the tablet can call a thing that harms the monastery, I will not risk the scriptorium, she said. Her words hit like a struck bell. Thomas objected fast. Sister Miriam, do not burn it. We can study the gestures and transcribe the sounds. We will be accused, Miriam answered. We will lose novices, and the monastery closes. I will not endanger them for curiosity. The researcher stepped between them and put his hand on the crate. Miriam, he said, you rescue people by keeping knowledge, not by destroying evidence. If we burn it, we lose any chance of understanding the phonetic pattern and why authorities feared it. A sharp exchange followed with 6 short lines of dialogue. You will tell the abbot. Miriam, no, the researcher. We do what is needed to protect lives and knowledge. Thomas pleaded. What if the sounds are dangerous? The researcher met Thomas' eyes and answered simply. Then we must know which sounds and why. Their argument did not resolve. It divided trust. The group retreated to the inner sanctum for a quieter council. The researcher laid the marginal scrap beside the tablet and spoke slowly while he traced a wedge with his nail. He described with concrete detail how certain marks matched not letters but articulatory instructions. A hollow wedge for a nasal release, a dot for a held breath, a hooked line for a glottal stop. Thomas repeated the syllable in a tight voice, and then stopped because his ears rang. Miriam rubbed her temples. The researcher made notes in the black notebook. Catalogue number, provenance, observed anomalies. He wrote down the word from the smuggler. It flared when the torch hit it. He recorded that observation as evidence, not metaphor. They filed through paltry evidence in a sequence that produced the next external event. One of the archivists found a hidden marginal note in another ledger that referenced a seal matching a motif on the tablet. This discovery changed how they understood the tablet's origin. Thomas read the notation aloud. It names a city. Nipper, he said. The researcher frowned and drew a map fragment in the notebook with a quick line. If Nipper, he said, Then the tablet predates the local charters by centuries. Miriam's posture shifted. She leaned forward and ran a finger along a page edge. It is older than our catalogues. If it is proven to predate the church records, it will upset many established claims. Her voice did not rise. The implication did. They made a plan that required secrecy and technical labor. The researcher would transcribe the marks onto vellum and run controlled vocal tests. Thomas would prepare sound samples using a small reed instrument to match mouth shape. Miriam would rehouse the tablet in a sealed crate and mark it with a false inventory number to mislead any cursory search. The researcher drew a thin diagram of the mouth positions beside the transcriptions. They scheduled the tests for the evening, after the Inquisitor's patrols rotated. Each move counted as an act of concealment. Each action bore consequences for trust among them. Even as they worked, an unexpected twist arrived. The smuggler returned without warning and pushed into the back room with a maid's basket over his arm. He did not speak at first. He placed the basket on the table and opened it. Inside lay a clay fragment with the same glyph repeated, and a second note that named a person, a car, who claimed ownership. The smuggler said, "He sent me back." The tablet must not be studied. His face looked hollow. Thomas reached for the fragment and hesitated. "Who is a car?" "Miriam." The smuggler's jaw moved. "A trader. He bought the lot in the Eastern market." The man who tries to sell those words dies. The researcher felt a fresh rise of concern mixed with an obligation to probe. He felt the second required emotion shift. Suspicion, fear. They began the vocal test in the archive's small atrium. The researcher instructed Thomas in short phrases. Thomas to place the reed between his lips and hum an open vowel while he observed the tablet under a magnifying lens. Miriam kept watch at the shutter and whispered numbers from time to time. The researcher counted and wrote. He instructed Thomas, "Start with a neutral vowel. Then add the nasal mark." Thomas obeyed. He made a sound like a purse of breath. The lamp flame changed shape. It stretched into an oval and then snapped back. Dust motes moved in a narrow spiral across the table surface. Miriam's hand left a pale print on the wood. A sudden knock shattered the measured rhythm. Heavy boots on the stair. Inquisitor Luth's deputies had returned earlier than the warrant permitted. They banged and demanded entrance with a formal call. Sister Miriam moved to block the inner door. The researcher lifted his chin and stepped into the hall to meet them. Words passed fast. Loth's second appeared at the door and recited the warrant again with a new signature. "Open the inner sanctum now," he ordered. The researcher did not answer immediately. He looked at Miriam, then at Thomas, who clutched the reed. He calculated risks in a handful of breathless seconds and made a choice. The confrontation flared into violence when a deputy reached for the crate. Thomas moved to intercept. His shoulder struck the soldier's arm. The deputy swore and pushed Thomas aside. A scuffle followed with shouted names. "Thomas!" Miriam cried. "Inquisitor Loth." The deputy yelled. The researcher lunged, trying to keep the crate from being opened. In the pressing of bodies, Thomas's hand brushed the marginal scrap in his vest, and the syllable escaped his lips unintentionally. The room registered the sound like a struck bell. Glass in a nearby cabinet trembled, and a shelf of small jars rattled. The lamp flames sparked white for a heartbeat. The air in the hall produced a sharp, metallic ringing in the ears of those present. The effect was concrete and immediate. A single paganic marker on the tablet brightened, and threw a narrow stripe of pale light across the researcher's fingers. A thin sheet of paper lifted as if held by a small wind and then fell. Thomas doubled over, clutching his throat. He coughed and water sprayed from a broken vial into the gutter. Miriam walked forward and grabbed Thomas by the shoulders, keeping him upright. The deputy staggered backward with a red line across his cheek, where he had been struck by a falling shard. Luth ordered his men to bind anyone caught resisting. The deputies hesitated as the light on the tablet pulsed once more. No miraculous creature arrived. No visible being took form. but the room entered into a shared physical disorder. Hair lifted on forearms, distant bells chimed without hands, a loose tile popped upward. That was the destabilizing phenomenon. It changed how each person in the room weighed the object. After the shock, silence condensed into quick action. The deputy barked a new command and ordered a search. The researcher moved faster than the men expected. He pried open a false panel under the archive table and slid the tablet into a padded satchel. He shoved the satchel beneath his coat and locked his notebook in his fist. "We will present the inventory at dawn," he said, voice low and urgent. He did not elaborate. Sister Miriam forced a sharp laugh and folded the lamp into a cloth. Thomas coughed again and wiped his mouth. The deputy left with less evidence than he had expected, because the crate contained safe copies and blank folios. Luth's men mapped the room coldly and left a soldier at the outer gate. Later that night in the cellar, the researcher wrote a detailed entry in the black notebook. He described the syllable Thomas had uttered and the physical responses he had witnessed. He recorded each movement: flame tilting, jars vibrating, a small tile bucking. He wrote the smuggler's name, the note that mentioned a car, and the citation from the ledger bearing Nipper. He drew a careful diagram of the glyph that had flared and noted its matching seal on the fragment. He closed the book and felt the last emotion shift settle. Fear had given way to grim clarity and a renewed resolve to trace lineage rather than destroy evidence. They made a final choice. Sister Miriam insisted the tablet could not remain where any deputy might pry it loose. Thomas argued to move it to the infirmary reliquary, where relics were stored under an abbot's seal. The researcher weighed both options. He took the satchel, moved the crate's false lid into place, and carried the tablet to a small crate he had prepared earlier. He palmed the bronze signet ring at his finger and checked the lantern's fuel. He spoke one instruction to Thomas and Miriam: prepare the cellar board and the false floor. We bury nothing. We misfile. Thomas glued his lips together in a line and nodded. Miriam folded the lamp away and tied the key to a cord inside her habit. They worked by measured motions. Thomas pried 3 floorboards and set a shallow box into the void. The researcher slid the satchel into the box and closed it. Miriam hammered the boards back with tight, efficient blows. They sealed the crate beneath the floor with a rusted latchet and slid a dusted tile over the seam. The researcher wrote the tablet's catalog number on the back of his black notebook and pressed the pen tip hard enough to leave an impression. He whispered a single line to himself and then, concrete and precise, he said aloud, Catalog 2977. Hidden under cellar board 3, Thomas repeated the number to remember it. Miriam ran a finger over the seam to check for gaps. They tended to wounds and collected themselves. Thomas' hands shook less after water and a bandage. Miriam left the lamp in the inner sanctum with a careful note to the abbot's steward about repairs. The researcher recorded a short, factual entry describing the Inquisition's demand and the protest lodged by Sister Miriam. He locked the black notebook and slid it into his satchel beside the satchel that contained false folios. He closed the cellar door and set the latch. The final paragraph of that night's record was a deliberate and concrete beat. The researcher sealed the box with a private mark, then tapped the tile thrice and placed the key in the small niche behind a loose brick. When they extinguished the lamp, there was no high rhetoric. There was only careful breathing, soft furniture creaks, and the slow drip of water from the eaves. Thomas sat on the step and watched the door. Miriam arranged the steward's note and folded it into her pocket. The researcher checked his spectacles and felt the weight of the tablet's secret in his coat. He had written the tablet's catalog number on the back of the notebook. He had catalogued the marginalia that suggested performative instructions. And he had concealed the object beneath the cellar floor where only they would think to look. He set his hand on the crate's false lid and, with a controlled action, he closed the notebook and whispered the final line that would lead them forward. We trace its makers to Nipper. Then we decide what it does. He pushed the crate under the floor and hammered the final peg into place. Outside, a distant church bell struck in its slow cadence. Inside, someone on the stair set down a basin. The researcher breathed once, then wrote the night's events into a ledger entry that began with the smuggler's returned word. He placed the ledger under the black notebook and slid both into his worn leather satchel. He tightened the strap, checked the bronze ring on his finger, and then, as a final concrete action, he pressed his palm flat on the tile where the crate lay hidden and felt the faint warmth of that evening slamp travel through the boards. The chapter closed with the cellar door clicking behind them and Thomas whispering, "We will find a car," as they left the archive to the night watch and the long task ahead. The window exploded inward. Glass sliced the researcher's sleeve as a gloved hand lunged for the clay tablet. Suspicion flared in him before he even registered the thief's face. "Stop," Khalid barked, and the smuggler collided with the intruder in the lamplight. The intruder twisted, the tablet fell, and a shard of clay struck the floor with a sound like a small bell. Within seconds the room filled with movement. A snap of boots, the scrape of fabric, the hard exhale of someone running a hand over the object they meant to steal. Suspicion drove the researcher's first choices. He shoved his spectacles up his nose, felt the scar above his left eyebrow pull, and lunged. He had that same quick calculation he used to make when reading fragile glyphs. Measure the strength of a hand, the angle of a throw, the risk of exposure. The smuggler Khalid tackled the masked intruder, and the three of them rolled across the rug. The intruder's mask slit, revealing a jaw set in an unfamiliar line. "Hands off!" The researcher snapped. His voice stayed low. His hands moved to protect the tablet. Khalid swore, "Short and rough! Give it! Give it now!" Khalid's palm slammed down on the tablet. The masked figure reached, found the edge, and pulled. There was a crack sound. Clay dust rose. The lantern light bleached the room into sharp planes. The tablet split along an old fault line, and one of the larger glyphs opened like a seam. From that seam a faint, cold light breathed outward, not bright but clear enough for the researcher's eyes to register vibration along the carved lines. Fear arrived in the researcher's chest as a practical thing, a tightened grip, a breath held, an urgent checklist. He did not think of prophecy or legend. He thought of consequences. Possession of this object put him and Khalid on a list he could not see. He rose immediately, clasping the tablet fragments to his coat. "Khalid, get the lamp," he ordered. "Seal the window." Khalid moved faster than the researcher expected, ducking to grab bolts and fabric, while the masked intruder crawled away and vanished into the alley like a shadow pulled back into itself. Glass lay across the study desk. The brass-rimmed spectacles trembled where the researcher had dropped them. He turned the larger fragment in both hands. The glyph that had split now glowed along its fracture. The light tracked the same pattern that had flared in the smuggler's stall weeks earlier. The researcher remembered the smuggler's whisper. "Take it." He remembered the constable's torch and the shout, the way the tablet had flared in a crowded market. That earlier noise became proof now. Other people, other hands, were hunting these words. He dressed the wound on the tablet with linen and wax, because the object mattered first and the alarm second. The city could wait, but the text could not. Khalid propped a stained rug against the broken window and dragged curtains to muffle the glass. The researcher set the fragments under a bowl while he lit the hand lantern. He watched the glow leak across the edges of the clay and practiced breathing slow. Suspicion had shifted into caution. Caution would become action. Before dawn, the researcher walked with Khalid toward the monastery. Their footsteps hit wet cobbles. He kept his satchel close and his head down. He counted options with the same method he used to pass an unknown script. Rule out the impossible, then test what remained. Brother Idrin met them at the small scriptorium door. He stood with a candle stub in his hand and a knot of fear in his jawline. "You brought trouble, Brother Idrin." His voice was hushed but direct. His hands trembled as he set the candle into the holder. "You know why I am here," the researcher answered. He kept his voice flat because anger would be noisy and treasonous. He set the wrapped fragments on the table between them. "I need the vault." For a night, Brother Idrin looked at Khalid. Khalid shrugged in a way that argued for speed over subtlety. "I gave it to him." "Khalid," I said, "take it and run." "That was my job." Brother Idrin set both palms on the table. "Cade will not forgive us if she finds a banned text in our stacks," he said. He pronounced the magistrate's name like a threat. The researcher recognized the list of risks: ecclesiastical hearings, confiscation, a public burn. He also recognized a second list: the chance to study the glyphs in quiet, to learn whether the tablet's light had been a trick of reflection or an actual response to contact. They bargained until the first light pressed across the chapel roof. Brother Idrin agreed to a measured risk. Use the scriptorium vault, lock the door, and allow only 3 people near the fragments. He insisted on parchment logs to mark who entered. The researcher agreed. He wanted records for method and witnesses for safety. The monk's fear and the researcher's steadiness completed one another like a hinge. Inside the vault, the air smelled of boiled starch and old glue. Shelves rose like small cliffs of books. Layla, the assistant, arranged soft clothes on the table and polished the brass reading lamp until the rim flashed. Her hands were quick and composed. She moved like someone used to handling fragile things and secrets. She had been at the monastery 3 years and spoke with a bluntness that steadied Brother Idrin. "If Magistrate Cade hears of this, we're done. Layla." "You know she thinks words are weapons." Her tone was plain, not theatrical. She worked the linen over the tablet fragments. "I know," the researcher replied. He adjusted his spectacles, felt the mole near his jaw on the left under his collar, and measured the room's acoustics. The vault had stone walls and a low, flat ceiling that would amplify any sound. He set a leather, bound nook on the table and opened it to a blank page. He planned the method with minimal words: isolate, transcribe, test small. They began with sight. Layla cleaned one shard and traced with a fingertip. "This rune repeats," she said. "Here." 3 times, then the long stroke. Her voice held curiosity more than fear. The researcher named the pattern aloud, writing each stroke in his script. Brother Idrin coated his lips in a thin line and read aloud the scribe's notes from a previous catalogue. Their voices layered: the method of the scholar, the caution of the monk, the directness of the assistant. The ritual of study enforced a rhythm that reduced panic. When the researcher proposed a cautious vocal test, Brother Idrin looked at him as if considering the theology of small sins. "If we only form shapes with our mouths," the monk said, "and keep our voices flat, what harm can there be? We will start with vowels and stop if anything moves," the researcher answered. He chose a single syllable, plosive and brief, one that matched a small loop in the clay. He demonstrated the mouth shape and the breath one. Short, open. He emphasized the safety procedure: degrade the pitch, watch for heat changes, stop at the first sign. Layla inhaled and whispered the syllable. The candle flames bent away and guttered. The stone under their hands hummed faintly. Brother Idrin's knuckles whitened on the table. A loose scrap of parchment trembled and spun to the floor. The researcher noted the vibration under his fingertips, a slow mechanical thrum through the wood. He did not name it as supernatural. He noted the physical effect. "Stop, Brother Idrin." He reached for a bell. His gesture was a pledge of control. Layla's face tightened. Her lower lip trembled and she swallowed. "We must tell someone," the monk said. But the sentence hung because telling would begin the machinery of wrath. The researcher chose a different approach. "We will record this," he said. He placed his notebook in a padded box and set a simple instrument of measurement beside it. A strip of metal to test temperature, a length of twine to measure vibration, a small field to collect air. He would use instruments before witnesses because instruments created neutral testimony. Daylight had scarcely warmed the courtyard when Magistrate Cade arrived with 2 deputies. She carried herself without hesitation and without the softness of prayer. Her robe was cut for authority. She spoke like someone trained to end arguments by naming guilt. "Brother Edrin," she said, "I have reason to inspect your holdings. A report says banned glyphs were smuggled. Open your vault." Brother Edrin's face went flat. "Magistrate Cade, we have nothing illicit at hand." Cade's deputy stepped forward and cut the sentence with a flat hand. "Open the vault now." The words carried the weight of law. Cade's gaze fixed on the lantern. "Bring the tablet." Her voice had a professional coldness that meant she would supervise every step. The researcher lifted his hands in a manner that tried to show compliance and to protect method. "Magistrate Cade, I request only a controlled examination. Let us demonstrate sterilely. We will not declare anything until instruments confirm whether the object produces energy or not." He placed his notebook on the table as a buffer between law and study. Cade's lips tightened. "You test. I watch. One misstep, Brother Edrin, and you will answer to my court." Brother Edrin nodded. The researcher read the threat for what it was. A forced scrutiny that would not permit slow method. He angled his body to shield Layla and the fragments. The court would prefer eradication to understanding. Their forced performance began with transcription. The researcher guided Layla in copying a single sequence of glyphs to parchment. "Copy exactly," he ordered, "no pronunciation. Only transcription." Layla's handwriting snapped and clean. Brother Edrin murmured catalogue entries as if reciting a prayer of verification. Cade watched the pen strokes like a surgeon watching a scalpel. When the magistrate demanded demonstration to prove whether the tablet was harmless or weaponized, the researcher felt the tension rise, like pressure in a sealed room. He had arranged for instrumented steps and measured the stakes. Cade insisted on a voice demonstration in front of the deputies. The researcher argued for a truncated test. Layla would say a single syllable in a monotone. Layla hesitated at the edge of action. Her fingers tightened on the parchment. She looked at Brother Edrin and then at the researcher. "If I say this," she whispered, "and you told me not to." The researcher placed his hand lightly on her knuckles. He did not speak a blessing. He gave a plan: open mouth, small, flat breath. Stop at any sign. Remember the twine and the strip. If the twine moves, stop. If the metal warms, stop. If you lose hearing, stop. He spoke these steps in quiet, precise sentences. The plan grounded her. Layla the syllable, the tablet pulsed. A fine line of clay across a sealed symbol fractured with a sound like a snapped reed. The room lost some of its air. The candle flames bent and distilled into smoke that did not rise. The twine snapped taut and then slackened as if anchored to nothing. The metal strip warmed enough to sting a finger. Cade's deputy stepped backward. Cade's jaw closed so hard the skin at her throat moved. For a moment the presence sat on the edge of hearing, something external like a hand pressed against a door from the other side. No figure came through, but the air shivered against flesh. Layla's eyes widened. She put a hand to her throat and coughed. Brother Edrin dropped to his knees and took the nearest Bible to his chest. The researcher checked each instrument with methodical calm and wrote the numbers down. He felt fear, but he treated it as data. His fingers shook for a second, then was steady. Cade's voice cut. "Enough. Seal it and prepare to turn it over to the court." Her tone had moved from examination to adjudication. "Any priest who hides such a thing will be punished. Any scholar who pronounces it safe will be tried." Brother Edrin protested with a quick string of practical arguments. Contamination risk if the wrong hands held the object, the monastery's duty of learning. The fact that the scriptorium had identified a potential cure for famine in an old agricultural text. Cade listened and then dismissed the list. "The Holy Office will decide," she said. The researcher saw the motion of power. He also saw a second motion. Cade's certainty that words that could act were a threat to institutional control. He weighed options. He could hand the entire collection over and risk its destruction. He could attempt a planned demonstration under public witness that might allow instruments and arguments to show nuance. Or he could take action that would be illegal but preserve the fragment for further study. He chose a middle path. He offered a demonstration to Cade. A controlled pronunciation with 3 witnesses and instrument records, after which Cade could petition the court with his notes. Cade accepted on her terms. She would be present and would take custody if she judged the object dangerous. The researcher agreed because the alternative, refusal, would lead to immediate seizure. They prepared the demonstration. The vault's door was shut. Deputies stood near the threshold. The researcher directed the instruments into place. Layla sat within whispering distance and kept her palms on her knees like someone holding onto a ledge. Brother Edrin prayed in short phrases that matched the rhythm of inhalation and exhalation. Cade positioned herself with her hands folded and the deputies at attention. When Layla spoke the cluster of banned phonemes, she fractured the tablet's larger seal. The sound that came from her mouth was not a note, but a compact series of clicks and breath forms that the researcher had only seen sketched across the clay. The instrument twine rattled. The metal strip flexed and glowed red at one edge. The lamp flickered in a way that left the cast iron stand cold and the wick burned down to a nub. Then, like the snap of a trap, the seal broke and something in the room moved. A presence brushed the angles of the vault. It was not a figure but a pressure, a tail of cool air that traced the monk's neck and then rose along the shelves. The sound it made was the sliding of a great stone in its groove. Brother Edrin stumbled, his prayer cut short. Cade reached for the nearest deputy and barked an order. The deputies advanced, but their boots found nothing to grip. They recoiled as if the floor had shifted underfoot. The room filled with the mechanical groan of stone and the distant clatter of a bell in some other place. The researcher counted instruments and people. He saw Layla's face whiten and then flush with a kind of urgent clarity. She did not scream, "Stop!" She snapped, which was neither a prayer nor a protest but an attempt at command. Her voice created a practical pause. The deputy nearest her flinched. Brother Edrin covered his mouth and vomited on the floor. The researcher grabbed the biggest fragment and forced it down onto the table, pressing his palms over the cracked seal. Cade's expression shifted from professional control to a narrower, keener thing that the researcher recognized as fear folded into resolve. "Seal the vault," she ordered. Her deputies obeyed. They wrapped the fragments in linen and took them under escort to a room upstairs. The researcher did not resist that motion. There was too much risk in arguing in front of Cade's men. He watched the fragments leave with measured concern. The immediate breach ended in containment, but the moral and technical crisis hardened. Cade announced a purge. Brother Edrin argued for study. Layla collapsed into a chair and would not speak for several long minutes. Khalid stood outside the monastery cloister and fidgeted like someone who had just seen a life change its axis. The researcher felt a second emotion shift in him, from fear to a cold resolve that carried the weight of method. That night, under the shadow of the monastery walls and the pale ring of lamp light over the river, the researcher arranged a salvage. He watched the guards bring the wrapped fragments to a locked chamber. The deputies left their post for a moment to argue about procedure in the hall. Khalid moved like a man who had rehearsed escape paths. The researcher slipped through a side door, kept to the passageways the monks used, and met Khalid by the old cistern. "They'll burn it." "Khalid." He spat on the stone. His voice had the flatness of someone who keeps anger close, because it is safer than panic. "You saw the way they looked at Layla. They were terrified. Symbols can get priests burned for less. Then we must take a sample that cannot be destroyed by order." The researcher. He had already considered the litany of legal consequences. Theft of an ecclesiastical object would end his career. It might end his freedom. But the tablet contained rules about how phonemes tied names to presents. If learned and recorded, that knowledge might save lives or destroy them. He could not allow Cade's purge to erase the possibility of understanding. Khalid reached into his coat and produced a small blade. They entered the chamber when a deputy spoke to Cade down the corridor, when the sound of argument masked a slight thud in the other room. The cloth around the fragments had smoke stains. The linen rustled as the deputy set it down on a table. The researcher worked with the steady hands of someone used to cutting spines off books for repair. He took a singed sliver, no larger than a coin, scored it with a tool and wrapped it in a strip of his own linen. He placed it into a narrow file and sealed it with wax. They left without fanfare. Khalid kept to the shadows while the researcher walked with the feel against his chest, feeling the cold inside his coat. They moved to the river wall. Dawn found them shivering from the night wind. The researcher cleaned his glasses with a corner of his shirt and counted the cost aloud. "If Cade sees this gone," he said, "she will assume the monastery hid it. She will tighten the purge." He looked at Khalid. "We will need to work faster and quieter. We will need allies who can pretend to be enemies. We will need to write what we learn into the margins of safe books." His voice had a measured edge that showed resolve rather than bravado. Khalid laughed once, a quick sound. "Allies, where do we get allies? You have prayers, I have bad memories. Layla has a steady hand. Brother Idrin has fear. That's not much of an army." The researcher glanced at the thin file between his fingers. "We have a reason," he said. "And we have the fragment." They parted near the quay. The researcher walked with the feel in his satchel and checked his ring for a solid grip. There was no triumph in his step, only purpose. He had learned a new rule. Certain phonemes bound names to presence. Speech alone could bridge a name and an event. The discovery created a moral decision he could not avoid. The researcher resolved to continue the translation in secret, because he believed understanding would prevent misuse. That belief would ask him to risk everything. Before he wrapped himself in his coat and slipped into the market, the researcher paused and recalled the earlier scene when the smuggler had shoved the tablet into his hands and spat, "Take it." He considered that moment now as evidence rather than romance. Khalid had done his job and passed a hot object along a chain. Someone else wanted the tablet badly enough to break a window in the middle of the night. The researcher now understood why. Possession itself altered the landscape around the owner. He thought of Layla in the vault, her jaw clenched, the way she had commanded the pause that stopped the presence. He thought of Brother Edrin on his knees, vomiting holy words. He thought of Magistrate Cade's quick motion from magistrate to inquisitor. Each of these people had moved the story by their choices. The researcher catalogued those choices in his notebook. Khalid's daring, Layla's steadiness, Brother Idrin's fear, Cade's zeal. The list read like a taxonomy of risk. A twist arrived 2 nights later when the researcher compared Layla's transcription with a fragment of an older cuneiform tablet he had catalogued months earlier. He found the same repeated cluster, but in the older tablet it appeared not as a name, binding tool, but as an agricultural charm, used to bring rain. The implications changed the researcher's understanding. The same phoneme cluster could be used to bind presence to an action or to invoke a natural process. The sound could be adaptive. That meant one voice could call a presence. Another voice could redirect it. This realization reframed the earlier scenes. The masked intruder at the window had not sought the tablet merely to hide it. He had sought to control its application. Magistrate Cade's purge was not only fear of disorder, but a move to monopolize a tool she did not fully understand. The researcher wrote the new line in his notebook and underlined it twice. The twist forced a choice. Share this with Brother Edrin and risk institutional capture, or withhold it and attempt to learn how the phonemes rewired outcomes. He chose secrecy. He wrote instructions in a ciphered marginal note and taught Layla a danger, a verse method to practice articulation. She learned consonant placements and breath shapes, with the care of someone training to defuse a device. The researcher practiced alongside her, marking when his hands trembled, and then steadying them by tightening his grip on the brass-rimmed spectacles in his pocket. The second emotional shift settled into something like resolve, not recklessness, but a determined method to keep the fragments out of quartz and into careful study. The chapter closed on a concrete beat. They met at the river at dusk to exchange notes and a list of names who might be trusted. The researcher handed Layla the sealed feel of the singed fragment and said, "Keep this between us and Brother Adrian. No one else. If Cade searchers say you found nothing." Layla looked at him, then at the water, and nodded once. As they turned to leave, a footstep sounded behind them. The researcher froze, then felt Khalid's hand on his shoulder. Khalid mouthed a single, clear word, "Watch." It was not a prayer. It was a command to be practical. The researcher folded that instruction into his plan and moved away from the quay with the feel pressed to his chest. He had a fragment, a dangerous pattern, and a small, fragile coalition. The immediate threat had been contained. The larger war for the words had only begun. He walked toward the city, lantern light thin on the cobbles, and held to one fact. Someone would come again for the tablet. The night had taught him the grammar of danger and given him a rule to follow. He would continue the translation in secret, and he would do it with instruments and witnesses who could be trusted not to turn the sound into law. The chapter ended with him stepping through a narrow alley, the river behind him, the monastery bells muted by distance, and the single line of text left to translate recorded in his notebook for the next clandestine test. Khalid shoved a smoldering folio into the researcher's hands as a torch-bearing constable lunged and someone bellowed,
"Seize it!"
The manuscript hissed between his fingers. Fear tightened the researcher's jaw and made his fingers go numb. He pivoted, boots slipping on ash, and pulled the burned sheet clear of the pyre where robed officials pressed the crowd back with bayonets. Flames clawed at margin notes and letters pulled themselves thin and dark like wet skin. The immediate problem was visible and urgent. The Inquisition was destroying evidence in public, and possession now meant death. He smelled singed leather and the metallic tang of ash. The researcher, known in records as Khalid's partner in previous recoveries, but here called simply the occult researcher, kept his chin low and moved as if rehearsed. He had handled a clay tablet before that flared under torchlight. The memory of that tablet cutting a smuggler's hand remained crisp in his mind. The shard of clay that had sliced his sleeve, the blood that had dotted a dockboard. Suspicion had urged him then to hide the object. Now fear guided his hands to save what remained. "Khalid, hold the light." The researcher. His voice cut the crowd's roar. He spoke with measured cadence, but his hand shook once as he turned a page. Khalid obeyed and kept his body between the researcher and the nearest official. "We cannot let them take it." His words were a choice, not a plea. A robed official slammed an iron, shod staff into the earth, and the crowd sucked back. A man in darker robes stepped forward with a clipped voice. "By order of the court, that book is consigned for destruction." The researcher glanced at the man's seal, a stylized crown over a cross, and the name on his lips hardened into accusation. Inquisitor. He had seen that sigil on a warrant 2 nights ago. The stake was now public and immediate. Hand over the text or be arrested as an accessory. Khalid hustled them through a side alley while the pyre roared behind them. The chase pushed them into narrower streets, where shutters banged and laundry flapped like driven wings. Inquisitus men surged through the square, and the sound of their heels on cobbles multiplied. A hand snagged Khalid as they rounded a corner. He shoved the assailant off and drove his shoulder into the wall, breathing hard. The researcher kept the manuscript close to his chest, feeling heat through the folds. The alley narrowed to a single lane, and a cart blocked their path. Khalid swung the cart aside with 2 hard pulls, and they broke into an open backway that smelled of river mud and fish oil. They did not speak except to breathe orders. The researcher tasted smoke and iron and something else underneath, the faint sweetness of saffron and age, a residue of older rites. When a pursuer reached too close, Khalid spun and struck with the hilt of his blade. "Stay low," Khalid hissed. "Move left at the mill." The researcher obeyed. His legs pumped faster than he thought they could go. Fear shifted to adrenaline. His breathing steadied and the manuscript pressed into his ribs like a living animal. They made it to the hidden study above the river, the same cramped room where the researcher had once catalogued smuggled glyphs beneath a tobacco-stained lamp. The room smelled of old glue and cold stone. He set the manuscript on a narrow table and drew a closer lamp until the burned edges no longer swallowed the light. A glyph lay in the center of the page, dense black strokes that looked at once carved and spoken. Khalid leaned over the paper and tapped a finger against the glyph. The ink where his fingertip brushed shimmered, raising a faint silver film. The researcher hesitated and then exhaled. Fear began to loosen into bewildered curiosity. He laid a fingertip across the same line and felt a tiny vibration, like the hum of a reed pipe buried in a wall. It responds to touch. Khalid. He kept his voice low, but the words were surprised direct. It answers heat. The researcher watched the glyph lift. A thin ridge that caught the lamplight and cast a miniature shadow. He tested the motion with careful breaths. The glyph shivered as his breath brushed the paper, and the lamp's flame gutters flipped once to the side. Then the archivist arrived with a bag of corroborating fragments. She stood framed in the doorway, shoulders covered in patched wool, eyes bright behind clouded lenses. "You took your time," she said, and the line held no accusation. It held only the blunt truth of years. She placed clay slips and a scrap of parchment on the table. "These were copied in 3 provinces and then ordered destroyed 10 reigns ago," she said. She opened a thin roll and exposed a line of text identical to the raised glyph. Her fingers trembled when she handled the paper, and the researcher saw how the archivist's hands had the small, sure movements of someone who had unbound thousands of volumes, who ordered the purge. Khalid, his voice carried anger. The archivist's mouth tightened. "Counselors who feared rivals," she said. "Archivists who traded texts for favors. Kings who burned tongues that might bind armies." She set a palm on the manuscript as if to steady it. When her skin touched the paper, the glyph's ridge grew a tone deeper, briefly, like the lowest pipe of an organ. The researcher leaned closer, watching the archivist. Doubt flickered into suspicion. Had the archivist withheld information before? Her arrival should have eased them. Instead, her presence tightened the knot of danger. Suspicion changed the shape of their plan. He, who transported these copies. She named a merchant network and a hidden sect that had kept liturgy for centuries. "Not all tongues are public property," she said. "Some sounds were held in temples and passed down only by breath to breath. When power changed hands, so did the permission to speak." Her voice held the memory of burned lamps and shortened lines of chorus. The researcher saw in her face a map of losses, shelves empty where books had stood, seals dissolved in vinegar baths. Outside, a deputation marched toward the study. The Inquisitor himself arrived under a grey sky, his men unrolling a warrant and boots stamping the flagstones. He moved like a man who expected compliance and had been taught to believe force would shorten resistance. By authority of court and crown, the Inquisitor, cataloging their faces, "You will surrender the manuscript. To refuse is to impede justice and endanger the realm." He spoke cleanly and without flourish. Khalid stepped forward and answered with steel, "You have no justice here. You have flames and fear." He did not lower his hand from his sword. The researcher put his palm on the manuscript to keep it from being snatched. He thought of the clay tablet that burned when a constable's torch caught the stall, of the smuggler who had shoved a tablet into his hands at a jetty and spat one word, "Take it," before the window had exploded in a later raid. Those concrete images threaded straight into the present. He felt his suspicion harden into resolve. He could turn the paper over to save lives, or he could show the proof the tongue still worked. Either choice would cost something. The courtyard filled with shouted demands. The Inquisitor's men ringed the door. The archivist moved with a measured gait and set a brazier between the disputing parties. She claimed to be lighting it in ceremony, but everyone understood the brazier as a threat. The researcher watched faces. Khalid's jaw pronounced. The archivist's hand steady. The Inquisitor's lips pressed thin. The air smelled of cinders and a distant river fish stall. The researcher decided to demonstrate. He folded back a corner of the manuscript and traced the glyph slowly with a fingertip while speaking a descriptive line about its shape. He did not speak the forbidden phoneme aloud. He described the curve and sound with neutral words. As he traced, embers in the brazier rose. They lifted, unhurt by wind, and rearranged in midair to form a rough circle like a sigil. One of the guards staggered, hand over his throat. The courtyard's noise bled into a single intake of breath. The Inquisitor's eyes widened. Silence broke with a sharp command down. Someone shouted. A man from the Inquisition lunged, and the researcher jerked his hand back. The embers collapsed and the guard steadied, though his face had paled. The proof was now in the open. The signs carried active resonance. The balance of power stuttered and then tilted. The Inquisitor repeated the ultimatum, but now his voice carried the thin edge of calculation rather than certainty. Khalid stepped between the researcher and the Inquisition and spat. "You will not take it from us." His words were brief and dangerous. A small fight of bodies followed. The archivist did not raise her voice. Instead, she placed a wrapped parcel on the ground and peeled the linen away to show a stamped ledger, its entries listing names, dates, and places where texts had been seized. "They burned what they could not tax or control," she said. "This ledger proves it was not superstition. It was policy." Her fingers trembled. The researcher saw her knuckles blanch. The ledger altered the meaning of the pyre. It was no longer an isolated purge, but an organized, bureaucratic erasure. A new fear arrived. The political scale of the erasure meant many hands had a stake in hiding the truth. The researcher's earlier curiosity sharpened into strategic calculation. He realized the Inquisitor did not fear a superstition being proven. He feared scandal and loss of patronage. If the researcher could make the manuscript speak without endangering bystanders, they might force a legal reckoning rather than a summary purge. They argued in the yard for tactics. "We can smuggle it out in pieces. Khalid, send fragments to the merchant friends." He named alley routes and safe houses with clipped precision. The archivist rejected that plan. "They have lists. They will follow the merchants. They will collect the fragments and burn them elsewhere." The ledger shows this. The researcher listened to both men. Their voices sketched options. Each option carried its own danger. His hands moved as he weighed them, tapping the manuscript's margin until the paper left a dark smear on his fingertip. The Inquisitor's men tightened their ring. He spoke again, softer now. "Surrender, and no one else will be punished if they cooperate." His offer smelled of calculation. It wanted names in exchange for leniency. The archivist's eyes flicked to Khalid and then to the researcher. He saw her consider betrayal as a ledger might be read. Her decision would alter the course of their lives. The researcher watched the archivist touch the ledger's spine and then close her hand on it. She met his eye. "If I give them these names," she said quietly, "they will take people we cannot protect." Her voice dropped. The researcher felt anger, then a sudden, prickling guilt. He knew she had borne losses for the work and had kept secrets to preserve those still alive. The archivist stepped closer to the brazier and set the ledger down, fingers hovering near the burning coals as if testing heat. "No," she said, "I will not hand them any names. Destroy the page if you think it necessary. But do not give them what they demand." Khalid's mouth was a line. "We must decide now," he said. Rapid dialogue followed as they traded short directives and objections. "Burn it," Khalid urged, hide it, the archivist. The researcher put his palm flat on the table and silenced them with a single slow phrase. We cannot hand them the ledger. We cannot watch another list be made. His voice carried the choice. He felt the weight of the manuscript like a thing with its own will. The inquisitor moved at last. He indicated with a gloved hand, and one of his lieutenants stepped forward to seize the paper. Khalid lunged and struck the lieutenant in the wrist, steel singing in the motion. A scuffle exploded. The researcher cursed and shoved the manuscript into the brazier, believing the flames would consume it instead of letting the Inquisition take it. He expected the paper to flare and be lost, but as the manuscript met the coals, smoke did not climb aimlessly. The letters steamed and peeled upward in thin black ribbons, and the brazier's embers streaked out like sparks that coalesced into a shape. The supporting character, the smuggler who had delivered the first tablet weeks ago, grabbed a burning edge and dragged the manuscript free. He cried out and then collapsed, a sound that cut through the courtyard. He had his shirt aflame where the paper had adhered. Khalid rolled him and stamped at the fire. The smuggler cuffed and spat blood. His hands were blistered. He pushed himself up with a single raw laugh and grabbed the remainder of the manuscript, pressing it to his chest. The researcher saw the man's face gaunt, with a stubborn set to the mouth, and realized an ally had chosen to shield the text. The man used his body as an argument. The courtyard became a theater of violence, guards lunging, citizens screaming, embers scattering like strange insects. The Inquisitor ordered arrests. Khalid shouted a name and several friends moved to block. In the scuffle the manuscript tore. Half slid into a wet gutter, and the rest flared again in the brazier until a supporting character grabbed it one last time, and a cloth went up beneath him. A sudden, unexpected pivot changed the scene. The smuggler, clutching the bleeding page, fell on his knees and drove himself toward the brazier, using his body to shove the remaining paper into the flames. His chest heaved as if something had been decided. The researcher reached out to stop him, but Khalid caught his wrist and shook his head. The smuggler's breath was a rasp. "Take it," he mouthed, eyes fixed on the researcher. Then the paper vanished into flame and the smuggler sagged back, skin blackened and smoke rising from his hair. He did not stand again. The courtyard went quiet except for the crackle of dying embers and the hard breathing of those still standing. The researcher felt a hollow knock inside his chest. The cost of keeping knowledge was now a man's life. He had not intended such a sacrifice. Grief and guilt filled him, and the fear that had driven his first decision folded into a new sorrow. Smoke and confusion bought time. The researcher, Khalid, and the archivist slipped through a back exit while the Inquisition processed bodies and statements. They ran toward the river under a sky relieved of clouds by dawn. At the jetty, the researcher watched water lift the last ash as if the river were trying to swallow the evidence. The manuscript remained half burned. Loose sheets clung to the researcher's satchel in black curls. Khalid carried a limp arm over his shoulder, and the archivist moved with a limp of her own, her hands stained with soot. They reached a sheltered inlet, and the researcher set the ruined pages on a flat stone. He opened his narrow notebook and wrote the details in measured lines. Names, times, the Inquisitor's warrant number, the ledger's entries he remembered. He recorded the smuggler's last phrase, one word, torn and hoarse, and the image of him shoving the page into the flame. The act was a final, concrete event to tether them. A mark lingered on the researcher's palm where he had pressed the manuscript. It was a faint raised sigil, no larger than a thumbprint, black against his skin. He scrubbed at it with river water and sand. The mark only smudged, then reappeared as a thin dark crescent. He felt a small sting and then a low hum that the archivist she had felt before in older copies. "It does not go away," she said. He buried the shattered pages in wet sand and laid the half-burned seal beside them. The seal had a curved-termed symbol he could not read fully. He pressed it into the sand and covered it with the tide eddy. He wrapped the ledger in oilcloth and left it hidden in a false bottom of the satchel. Khalid tightened the satchel strap and checked the edges of the boat. The archivist touched the researcher's wrist and said, "We have proof of systemized erasure, but not enough to topple the court yet." Her voice was flat, not resigned. "You will have to travel east to the merchant routes and check the copying house ledgers. There are names there." He nodded. The researcher felt an internal shift. Fear had become a grim resolve, and then an exhaustion that made his shoulders burn. Emotion shifted again, from grief to a slow, careful determination. They pushed off, and the river carried them under low bridges and past watching faces. The researcher leaned back and pressed his palm to his chest, where the seal's dark crescent mirrored the mark on his skin. He had protected a tongue with sound and blood and fire. He had lost an ally. The ledger would travel in secret to allies, and the archivist would ferry fragments to safe hands. The Inquisitor had a public victory on the pyre, but privately his men had walked away with smoke on their uniforms and questions in their eyes. On the shore, a gull pecked at a half, burned scrap and lifted it into air. The researcher watched until the scrap fell away and dissolved into water. He felt the weight of the ledger in his satchel and the hollow in his chest where the smuggler had been. He wrote one last line in his notebook. "If sound can shape embers, then those who can shape sound shape people." The ledger proves intent to silence. He closed the book, pressed the seal to the linen, and tied the bundle. Before they left the jetty, a boot crunched nearby. The researcher turned. An assistant from the city archives stood with a wrapped parcel and a note written in an old hand. "From the archivist of Harran," the assistant said, handing it over. "She says this may explain the half of the script you recovered." The researcher unwrapped the parcel with fingers that still trembled and found a small carved seal half, buried in wax, its edge worn smooth. He pressed the carved seal into his palm and found the black crescent matched the impression. He tucked the seal into his satchel. A single concrete action anchored the ending. He zipped the satchel and stepped into the boat. Khalid pushed with an oar. The archivist took one last look at the jetty, then set her face toward the city and the ledger they would hide. The researcher felt the hum under his skin, the mark on his palm, and the silence left by the smuggler's absence. He laid his head back against the boat's timber, and, while the river carried them away, he said nothing. A small wind tugged the edge of his coat. The seal in his pocket lifted once and fell back. The chapter of the manuscript had closed in flame and loss, but the mark on his palm and the ledger in the satchel meant the forbidden tongue had not been fully erased. He understood, with the slow clarity of someone who had watched a list be burned and then recorded its names, that their work would continue. He folded his fingers around the satchel strap, and the boat cut the current toward the next town. At the riverbank, a gull cried once as if to punctuate the moment. Khalid's voice broke the thin dawn. "Who do we trust next?" The researcher answered with a single, direct name from the ledger and pointed upriver. The archivist watched him and then, without further words, guided the boat into the channel. They left the jetty and the blackened circle of the pyre behind. Their losses were counted and the rote for the ledger had been set. The researcher pressed his palm to his satchel and felt the faint, persistent vibration under the seal as the river carried them into a daylight they would now have to face with fire in their memory and method in their hands.